Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Nadera. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown University. And it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to today's event, The Cunning of Gender Violence, Geopolitics and Feminism. Today's event is initiated by Professor Rema Hammami, who is the first of 3 visiting fellows in Palestinian studies this semester, with funding through the Mahmoud Darwish Chair in Palestinian Studies. Ruba Saleh and Noor Erakat will be joining us later in the semester. And some of you will have been listening to Rema Hammami last week to talk about her work on gender-based violence in Gaza. Today, Rema has invited her 2 colleagues and co-authors, Professors Lila Abu-Lughod and Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, to discuss some of the main themes in their forthcoming co-edited book entitled The Cunning of Gender Violence, Geopolitics and Feminism. Let me introduce the speakers of today's event. Rema Hammami is the founding member of the Institute of Women's Studies at Birzeit University, where she is Associate Professor of Anthropology. She is the founder and former chair of the university's Right of Education campaign and co-founder and former director of the Women's Affairs Center in Gaza. She is active on issues of academic freedom and gender justice in and for Palestine. Her current research focuses on the collusion between liberal peace building, neo-humanitarian intervention within the logics of the ongoing Israeli military occupation, with an emphasis on how the aid industry deploys gender techniques of rule across the West Bank and Gaza's fragmented geopolitical spaces. Lila Abu-Lughod is the Joseph L. Buttenweiser Professor of Social Sciences at Columbia University, where she teaches anthropology and gender studies. Her scholarship, mostly ethnographic and based in Egypt, has focused on the relationship between cultural forms, gender and power, the politics of knowledge and representation, and the question of human and women's rights in the Middle East and globally. She is the author of Veiled Sentiments, Honor and Poetry in a Bedouin Society, Writing Women's Worlds, Bedouin Stories, Dramas of Nationhood, The Politics of Television in Egypt, and Do Muslim Women Need Saving? A member of the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia, she co-edited with Ahmed Saidi, Nakba, Palestine 1948, and the Claims of Memory. And then Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian is a Palestinian feminist. She is the Lawrence D. Beale Chair in Law at the Faculty of Law, Institute of Criminology, and the School of Social Work and Public Welfare at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the Global Chair in Law at Queen Mary University of London. Her research focuses on trauma, state crimes and criminology, surveillance, gender violence, law and society, and genocide studies. She is the author of numerous academic articles and books, among them Militarization and Violence Against Women in Conflict Zones in the Middle East, the Palestinian Case Study, published in 2010, Security Theology, Surveillance and the Politics of Fear, Incarcerated Childhood and the Politics of Unchilding, all by Cambridge University Press. She also co-edited 2 books, the latest entitled When Politics Are Sacralized, Comparative Perspectives on Religious Claims and Nationalism. And the three guests today are, of course, co-authors, co-editors of the book that we are going to discuss today. So the format of today's conversation is that we will be in conversation for a while, and then there is time for Q&A. If you have any comments or questions, put them in the Q&A function. So welcome, everyone. I'm now going to turn over to Rema to say a few words. You're muted, Rema. You're muted.
There we are. First of all, I'd really like to thank Nadia and the team at New Directions in Palestine Studies the Brown Center for Middle East Studies at the Watson Institute, including Barbara Oberkota, for doing all of the invisible but very important work in setting up the seminar. And also on behalf of the three of us, we'd really like to thank the Luce Foundation, whose support enabled the comparative research project, on which the forthcoming book is an outcome of, as well as what we're going to be speaking to today. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'm really excited to be having this conversation with you today. And to start out with, I was wondering if each of you could tell us a little bit how you got interested in the issues of violence against women and gender-based violence as international agendas within global governance. Now, how does this issue actually link to your previous research trajectories or your activism? So Nadera, would you like to start yourself?
Thank you again, Nadia. And it's also our chance to thank the Luce for a wonderful project. Well, I came to the topic through my training. I'm a clinical social worker. I started as a clinical social worker. So it's my activism as a social worker and as a criminologist that works with survivors and victims of abuse of power. And my first encounter was with Palestinian the schoolgirls who were interrogated in police stations here in Salahuddin Street, and those who were sexually abused and harassed. So the first thing that came was silence and invisibility that the girls were faced with. And during my PhD research on violence against women in occupied East Jerusalem and afterward, I started noticing how local and international governance, the intervention practices, laws are so racialized, and they are racialized tools in the hands of the settler colonial state here. So I realized that there is an army of UN bureaucrats that are working, international NGOs that are working, aid workers, private security companies, military specialists, human rights lawyers, and all are really all of a sudden experts in developing new mechanisms through which certain others, particularly the terrorist other, the Muslim other, the Palestinian women and men other, have been really demonized and criminalized. So being a clinician, during the first Intifada, teaching social work at Bethlehem University, working with Palestinian feminists at the Women Legal Aid and Counseling Center, to establish a hotline, which was really our first hotline for abused women in the area, and directing the hotline for 10 years. That all made me realize not only the gravity of violence against women, but more the way it was silenced, the way it is visibilized, invisibilized, hypervisibilized, and governed. And I have observed how politics, the biopolitics, those who gets an ID, who gets to be a citizen, who is a resident, who is counted, who is not counted, the way ideology and geography are very complex, contemporary, gendered global machineries of governance. And here comes the issue of violence against women and GBV. So I've noticed all those, elements, the language of we're saving, we're caring, we're helping, we're treating, we're protecting, we're supporting women. And it's about, women that are backward, religious, culturally, and socially. So here came my work, or pathologizing them while apoliticizing and ahistoricizing the context.
Yeah, of course, that resonates a lot, knowing your fantastic work. And Rema, we've already discussed it in some ways, but I was wondering if you could also answer this question.
I'm sorry, it will be a bit of a repeat of what I mentioned last week. But I think it's really interesting, even though Nadera and I are both in Palestine, we both sort of came to this issue on a different trajectory. For me, I think the issue sort of came to me as opposed to me going to it. And based on my location at, the Institute of Women's Studies at Birzeit University. As I mentioned, we have always been on the front line, especially since the Oslo period, of any global new gender agenda that comes to Palestine by international agencies and NGOs. And, you know, as I said, especially sort of once we had the Oslo peace process, there was just this invasion of all of these institutions and agencies for the peace process, state building, blah, blah, blah. And they brought a whole new language around gender and feminism into Palestine, one that, you know, we really had no idea about. But the agenda around violence against women, that global one, didn't arrive until post-2005. And as I said in last week's talk, it quickly took up a position of becoming the singular global gender agenda here. Compared to previous ones, it swamped out everything else and has remained hegemonic for more than 15 years. So now almost any agenda has to justify itself in the language of how it contributes to combating violence against women, etc. So at the Women's Studies Institute, we all, you know, quickly started to get this real sense of discomfort, particularly with the sort of hegemonic representations of gender relations in Palestinian society that were being put forward by these global frames and discourses that basically were saying that, you know, Palestinian society was one where male violence against women in the family was rampant, socially pervasive, condoned also by women. And that just simply didn't represent what we knew from our experience and research. I mean, yes, domestic violence is a problem here as it is anywhere, but the claims about the scale, you know, the sort of pandemic scale of domestic violence in Palestine just didn't add up to the society that we knew. So all of us over the years at the Institute have tried to critique and take this whole thing on, but without getting terribly much traction, because it really is so incredibly powerful. And as I mentioned last week, my first line of attack was around the metrics that sort of was evidence of this pandemic of domestic violence in Palestine. And, you know, I went on to just sort of deconstruct the normative global statistical frames that produce this evidence. And, you know, along the way, what I discovered was these best practice frames that produce the statistical evidence in Palestine that's used everywhere in the global South, were consciously designed to produce maximum prevalence levels. I mean, it's inbuilt to the whole frameworks. And these frames are never used in countries of the global North, where instead sort of the norm is what's called crime victimization surveys that also epistemologically cannot produce high levels. I mean, it always produces low prevalence levels. So in both cases, the outcome, the statistical outcome, is really epistemologically built into the frameworks. Anyway, and then I wanted to find out, well, how in the hell did this happen? You know, the situation of what I ended up calling statistical apartheid. And that then led me to the whole early history of this great feminist success story of the global anti-violence against women agenda. And within that story, I traced the allied one around the fight over statistical measures, which was another one of their great success stories, getting that kind of measure adopted by the United Nations after they had failed by getting their own Northern European and American governments to adopt it. I mean, it's all this thing about sort of the energies shifted to international institutions where they could win this agenda, they could move it forward. So in short, I came to the issue from the location of being at the receiving end of that history and how it arrived in the form of a very powerful normative agenda promoted by international agencies on the ground.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. I mean, I have to say that one of the points that really strikes me is this idea of statistical apartheid that you mentioned, and the way that I can see it. I mean, especially having moved to the US recently, the way that quantitative research is still so very much glorified as this objective science, and so your work is really, really important also in that regard. Lila, I was wondering if you could also tell us your trajectory and how that fits into the book.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I love listening to my colleagues. And I actually came to the project through a really different path than Nadera or Rema in their separate ways. And as you know, Nadia, we never know how to, all of this, but as an anthropologist who'd lived in and written about women and gender, among other things, in a couple of rural communities in Egypt, I'd really barely encountered gender violence. And I didn't actually encounter any of these armies of activists saving people from it. What I did know of, some incidents of marital arguments. I'd seen how the community itself had all kinds of ways of dealing with it, how the women had particular ways of dealing with it. But what I did hear a lot about was something that Nadera also worked on, but in a different way, was honor and the importance of honor to everyone, especially girls. And in my first two books, really, I'd written about honor and modesty as values that were part of a complex moral system. And I tried to understand how women both wanted to live up to the ideals and also challenged them in particular ways. And later, when I started working on popular television dramas in Egypt, the late 80s, 90s, I started worrying about something else. Okay, so there's the moral system there, but then I started worrying about the kind of prejudices that I felt urban educated elites in the TV industry had towards the kinds of rural groups that I had spent my time with, decades with, either the Bedouin in the Western Desert or the villagers in Upper Egypt that I'd done work with. And I was really puzzled by the feminist TV writers, the few, and other civil society activists who thought that these kinds of women needed empowering. And what they didn't seem to appreciate were two things that seemed really obvious to me. First, that there were systems in place for women to assert rights when they were wronged, and that most of the women were proud of the morality of the systems they were living in. They were not questioning even the gender inequalities there. So should we take their views seriously? But more important for me, I think, leading to this, what led to different work and to this project was what captured my attention, at least living with the villagers in the South, which much more disadvantaged, was that they lived with ongoing sources of violence that were not being addressed by those supporting women's rights or working for women in particular, like the economic policies that, as you know, in Egypt were impoverishing people in their communities, or the surveillance and violence of the security police and government bureaucracies that were fining and harassing them. And I was sort of aware of the way people were struggling, especially in this village where we worked, but they were struggling as families, not as women. But then, so that was one thing. But then 9/11 happened and the US invaded Afghanistan, and suddenly my sights were set much bigger, right, than these villages and these locations in Egypt. And like so many, I was appalled at the way that the plight of the poor Afghani woman oppressed under the violence of the Taliban, and by extension, the plight of Muslim women everywhere, was used as an alibi, as Gayatri Spivak called it, or justification, or let's say rationalization for a military invasion. And this kind of instrumentalization of a feminist agenda for violent military intervention got me really worrying about feminism in a different way. And so I started working on something bigger than ethnographies of particular communities. And Do Muslim Women Need Saving, the book that you mentioned, was the book I ended up writing to address these issues and problems in the representation of Muslim women. And I think, you know, Nadia, you felt the same way about stories about the oppression of Iraqi women that were trotted out as part of a justification of the US occupation of Iraq. And you and Nicola and Zahar Ali, you've all tracked the way this invasion and production of sectarian rule actually devastated Iraqi women in many ways. So that was what was going on there, and my work followed it. But around the same time, and I probably not coincidentally, as I'm thinking about this, the horrors of the honor crime became big news in feminist circles. So there are 5,000 a year, 5,000 in one country, 5,000 worldwide. We don't know, the 5,000 just travels, speaking of statistics, just from, it migrates from study to study. There were memoirs of honor crimes that turned out to be hoaxes. There was a constant refrain about this in the kind of high profile work of darlings of the anti-Muslim right establishment, like that of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. So this kind of incitement to discourse on this particular form of gender violence seemed to me to be working ultimately to stigmatize Muslim men, whether in the Middle East or South Asia or as immigrants. And I sort of had to figure out what was behind it. So, and that went into the book as well. So my path was really scholarly. I was not a feminist activist, as you know, but something about the way gender violence was being mobilized troubled me. So I think this is very different from the way Nadera started and still works as an activist as well as scholar, or Rema, who's been involved in development and women's studies and in projects around women and state building and humanitarianism now. So I came to it really through the production and circulation of public discourses in the US and Europe. And when I was thinking about this, you can imagine how vindicated I felt in my suspicion about this category of honor crime when it appeared in Trump's executive order of the Muslim ban as one of the reasons to exclude Muslims and to surveil them in this country. And I was really, you know, some of us scholars never think our work has any effect, real world effect, but I was invited to contribute to a whole set of statements that were part of a case brought to the Supreme Court against Trump for the Muslim ban. So, you know, sometimes it does do some good, the puzzling over this gap, but I didn't really have the right language or theoretical tools to think about all of this coming from the kinds of projects that I'd done before. And so I wanted to learn from people who had some of these tools and understood the world in a different way than I did. And that brought me in touch with Rema and Nadera and with Letty Volpe and Dina Siddiqui and so many other people, including people involved in thinking about governance, feminism, who I think had better understandings of the long history and local ways of feminist organizing around gender violence in different places. So it was kind of the gap between my experiences with some women I cared about and respected in particular places in rural Egypt and what I call this common sense discourse that circulates about women needing saving from their violent men and their religion or their culture that made me want to know more. And it really has been quite a journey for me, you know, really transformative over these years that we've been talking and working on this issue. And, you know, to echo what Rema said, you know, we were able to bring together so many incredible people for this project through the funding that we had through the Luce Foundation. And just to remind us of how it started. You know, we did call it at the time, the project, Religion and the Global Framing of Gender Violence. We didn't call it the Cunning of Gender Violence yet because we hadn't thought it through. And maybe we can talk about later, you know, sort of how we developed the framework that we did.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I noticed that in the book you coined this GBVAW. So just for people who don't know, so if you see GB, that refers to gender, I mean, actually GBV refers to gender-based violence, and then VAW refers to violence against women. But you actually put this together, and you put this together to differentiate it from another term that you use throughout the book, which is gender violence. So can you explain that? Rema, do you want to start?
Yeah, GBVAW, you can't say it. Yeah, okay, so, you know, there's a large, diverse, and increasingly critical feminist literature that sort of charts the successful integration over the past 3 decades of, you know, what used to be really marginal feminist concerns around women's bodily integrity into powerful normative agenda within institutions of global governance. I mean, we're not the first people to sort of note that. Violence against women is now addressed by myriad Security Council resolutions, famously starting with UN 1325. The only time the Security Council ever mentions women is in relation to violence, right? It's been recurrently addressed at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, you know, sexual violence and war. It's long been integrated into global development imperatives. So you've got CEDAW commissions, and most recently you've got it integrated as a target within the SDGs. It's been made a conditionality for countries wishing to ascend to the EU. It's been encoded as a priority to be addressed in any context of humanitarian intervention. It's in protocols and conventions around human trafficking, as well as those of the global refugee asylum regime, where more recently it's been made grounds for LGBTI individuals to claim asylum. And it's recurrently asserted and invoked as a global security issue. I mean, it's even got a name. It's called the Hillary Doctrine. And in its latest iteration, it's been linked to sort of the new trend in anti-terrorism, combating violent extremism, which is the subject of Lila's chapter. So it's been described as a transversal issue in the UN, and as well as producing a norm cascade. You know, I can go on and on. So what started out as a feminist agenda 30 years ago is now a powerful set of norms and instruments integrated across multiple arenas and forms of global governance that have made addressing violence against women, or GBV, an imperative for this huge range of institutional actors, and provides them a vast range of codified practical protocols, modalities, and procedures through which to do so. And along with this, it has extremely powerful representational force, you know, within these institutions and far beyond. Certain types of violence against certain women in certain places, as we know, always gets extremely high media visibility. So it's this power knowledge formation that we've given this rather unwieldy acronym to, GBVAW, with the selective and instrumental take-up of issues around women's bodily integrity into multiple modes, trajectories, and technologies of contemporary global governance. I mean, in the book, sometimes, you know, we've used it, or we see it operating as an apparatus, at other times as an assemblage, and still others a master code or a technology. And indeed, it can be all of these. Because rather than operating on its own, its power comes from locking onto main ruling apparatuses like global security or development. And it's sort of actively taken up by their political rationales and translated into their modalities. So it's extremely adaptable as it travels with these many governmental bedfellows. It constantly produces changing, reigning objects. You know, as we show in the book, we've got sexual violence and war at one moment, then we've got child marriage at another, we've got trafficking, and then there's always sort of the bread and butter mainstay of domestic violence. So we distinguish that from the broader term gender violence, which we think is a necessary political category that feminists and feminisms need to hold on to in order to speak to the lived realities of violence in gender relations, dynamics, and hierarchies, which is, you know, as we know, overwhelmingly wielded against women and LGBTI people historically in the present, and how these intersect with a range of other forms of oppression and exploitation. We don't give gender violence a definition, because that would end up doing exactly what we're critiquing, creating fixed frames and exclusionary terms and concepts to address what we know is a very complex range of human experiences of harm, and they're linked to gender. So both terms, gender and violence, even on their own, are notoriously slippery, and sticking them together doesn't sort of make a specific meaning more obvious, but we actually see that as a positive. The slipperiness or fluidity of meaning allows the term to be an open and generative analytic and political concept, one that recognizes that experiences and meanings of violence and their intersection with gender are context-specific and situated, and that rather than a homogenizing universal VAW or GBV that erases specificity and difference, this more open concept can recognize that located movements and activists struggling for gender and wider forms of justice have different readings and priorities of what these concepts might include or mean. So it's a way to not centralize a meaning, at the same time to retain a very necessary, needed political category. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. That really clarifies it. I appreciate it. So there's gender violence, but then there's a title, The Cunning of Gender Violence. So, I mean, the way I understood is that The Cunning of Gender Violence, the book focuses on the selective ways a visionary feminist project has folded itself into world affairs. But what do you exactly mean by the cunning of gender violence? Nadera, would you like to tell us?
Yeah, yes. I think that after hearing Rema and really going into the analysis of the way the system is operating both epistemically and the actual violence, our upcoming book states that the cunning of gender violence is there to explore the dynamic political and institutional circuits that GBVAW inhabits, that GBVAW consolidates and animates. So it's there to trace the silences and omissions of these categories and expose it through carefully researched case studies and the different amazing contributions, how prevailing assumptions that organized GBVAW may be affirming, maybe enabling, or even sustaining rationales and systems of power that are harmful and at odds with the intent of the feminists who pushed for them. So let me give you an example from an encounter that I had last week with the representative of a major European funders that do not speak Arabic, that came to one of the community centers here in occupied East Jerusalem, and that I work with, where that community is facing housing demolition, confiscation of land, eviction orders, and are being threatened to be erased totally as a community. So the community center gathered and connected over 250 children, worked collectively with a large community of women and men, the young and the old, engaging with their daily struggles. And they kind of opened up to the funders. And they wanted to show the effect of the mundane settlers, violence, and so on. So the community center was so excited to host the funders, European funders, and prepared various sessions. There were children and youth and men that came and shared. They testified, they told them their stories of power, the stories of enduring the loss of their homes. And the stories were amazing. A young woman being under home arrest, deprived of her ability to acquire education. Another old man that shared with us that he was in his father's arms in 1948 in Deir Yassin, yeah, when his father was slaughtered and he had to be displaced. So he lived in the old city, and then he moved to that neighborhood, and now he's under the threat of being evicted. And another story shared of a young schoolgirl who talked about her participation in a project called Ana wa Ukhti, Me and My Sister. So it was a long day of sharing, of giving stories of men and women working hand in hand. And they also made food, gathered us, put music, danced. And at the end of the day, you know, they really exposed themselves, exposed the conditions of their violated space, of their violated homes, of their violated schools, of their violated neighborhoods. No? After hearing all this, you know, the group of the funders came, and 3 prominent members of the funding group insisted on telling us all while we're sitting that they need to know, what do we do about violence against women? How do we work on violence against women? What do you do? Are you trained to deal with it? And this is really important. It included psychiatrists and psychoanalysts, the group. How do we know whether we're trained? And they kind of insisted this is a pathology that exists in this society. Of course, most of the people around me, the women, were veiled because we were, you know, this is how we are dressed. And how do we deal with violent men? And it's crucial to them. Nadia, I was so outraged at the failure to acknowledge the amazing power of the center that was all geared towards refusing to accept violence as normal. And I kind of stayed silent. And Sausan, one of the leading members of the community center, spoke to me in her eyes. She was looking at me, and what can we do? As if telling me, and what exactly is happening here? Is it possible that we can lose their funding? And how should we respond? I felt the violence of their questions. And I even told them that your question is violence against women. And it was so strong when Sausan text me telling me, ما هو كل اللي بنعمله ضد العنف. All we do is against violence. So the manner in which the questions were raised, the conditions of the funding and conditioning on it, on violence against women and fighting men that are revealed how the funders and their operational systems ignores the overarching problems that create violence against women. Settler colonialism, military occupation, political violence, the fact that the funders imposed their agenda, the way they posed the questions was in fact putting us all down, exercising this control to me, to the entire scene. And we were silent, yeah? And their violent against women agenda seemed like a supremacist toxic feminism, yeah? If it is feminism. The funders were described as like interrogators by the group members, like that are serving the state. And as if they're kind of hiding under this umbrella of violence against women. And it's, so here, as in many similar cases, gender violence or GBVAW was central not only to power making, but further to undermining the community, the history, the context, and the present violent ordeal. It is in such encounter that we see the cunning of GBVAW. So the case studies presented in our book really suggest that these dynamics may not be external to the way in which GBVAW agenda works, but rather integral to whatever success this feminist agenda has had in past decades. So that is what we mean by the cunning of gender violence. We really follow the lead of Elizabeth Povinelli, whose cunning of recognition focused on the double binds imposed on Indigenous people in Australia by the apparently benign liberal multicultural policies of recognition, and Nancy Fraser, who puzzled over the disturbing convergence between some of second wave feminist ideal and demands on an emerging new logic of capitalism, post-Fordist, transnational and neoliberal. So the cunning of history, Fraser argues, lays in the ways that the women's movement's economic and cultural visions were split, such that their, and I quote, utopian desires found a second life as feeling currents that legitimated the transition. And end of quote, a transition at odds with the movement's vision of a just society. So this is where we try to highlight the way cunning, in which it it looks at justice, becomes entrapped and transformed through the politics of inclusion, but in ways that are two-faced. So systems of power appear responsive by taking up the language of injury and redress while re-articulating their substance according to political rationales profoundly inimical to the original demand, as well as to the needs of those who made them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so what I'm hearing, and also after having read at least the introduction and a couple of chapters, is the cunning is also the trick. I mean, there's a trickery, and the trickery very much links to concealing power or circuits of power. And so I'm wondering, one of the things that I find really found extremely illuminating was the way that the book tracks the mobilizations of GBVAW apparatus and the networks along the ways it travels, and the focus is on what you call the 3 circuits of power in your analysis. Now, Lila, maybe you can tell us what are some of the main findings and arguments in relation to this specific angle that you're pursuing in the book.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was something we really struggled with. And actually, a little correction, we ended up actually organizing the book in its final iteration around 4 circuits of power, because we realized, they're all entangled. But let me just talk a little bit about, share about how we got there, because it's not how we first thought about what we were doing, or what we were going to do in our first exploratory workshop. And we had many workshops and conferences and events and seminars. And I mentioned earlier that, we thought of this project as religion and the global framing of gender violence. So you could see even in the name, it was about framing, representation, but also a double meaning about framing particular perpetrators and letting other ones go unnoticed. But what we now say is exactly what you were referring to, that what we're doing is looking at the political and institutional circuits of GBVAW, what it inhabits, traverses, consolidates, and animates through these various case studies. There's so much to say about this, but we started with an interest in religion and, of course, Islam, and then we worked in Middle East and South Asia. Almost all the people we were engaged with were concerned about that, and we thought these were crucial analytical sites for developing this understanding because of the ways religion and racialized ethnicity, particularly the Muslim question, appeared so deeply embedded in the logics and underpinning GBVAW, as I guess we call it, in global and international governance. But I think I would, maybe there's a lot to say about this, but in detail, but I am aware of time. So I want to get back to the circuits of power because we struggled at the end. We had a variety of amazing papers, amazing participants, not all of whom are in the book, as you know, Nedja, since you published yours first. But, you know, for various reasons, people didn't get included in what is already a huge book. But the first brainstorming session, we sort of came up with a concept paper with 3 themes that we thought we would organize ourselves around: narratives of gender violence, the distributional effects of anti-violence agendas, you know, who got what from GBVAW, what we came to think of as GBVAW. And third, you know, alternatives to the way the agenda was currently organized. But after all our work and all the kinds of papers and conversations by these amazing feminist scholars and activists and journalists, because we were very concerned to always include them in our workshops and in our thinking, we realized that, you know, narratives sort of ran and representations ran through everything. It couldn't really be a distinct theme, although I think the journalists in the book take it up most specifically. And the third one, for complicated reasons, we still don't quite understand ourselves. As I was thinking about it, we didn't end up finding scholars who focused on groups that were producing truly alternative ways of dealing with gender violence. It's embedded in, you know, even the story that Nadera just told, but we were actually more struck by the way groups struggled not to be forced into certain molds, and how alternative visions that did exist were being silenced, or they were being ignored, or they were prevented from working because their approach didn't conform to the liberal or carceral forms of feminist GBVAW that was tied to these circuits of power. So how could we bring all this stuff together? You know, everything seemed so entangled. We found all these intersections among the work of different people working in Bangladesh, in India, in Palestine, in the United States, working at different scales. But we finally realized that we had to somehow sort out analytically or conceptually the different strands of what our individual cases were revealing. So we had to actually distinguish the circuits, different circuits of power in which the GBVAW agenda had become entangled or had attached it to it, because it wasn't quite the same across these different institutions. So the 4 we ended up with and organized the book around was first the, you know, what Rema mentioned, the global security world order, including, you know, war on terror and women, peace and security, all of that. Secondly, the institutions of the state and its violences, which are often less visible in the international feminist agenda against GBVAW, which tend to go after non-state actors or so-called failed states, and leave aside the violence of states like ones that we considered here, like Israel and India, that have powerful allies, and you can't do something about them. The third circuit was, we saw GBVAW working in very intensively, was what Rema has called the civilizational industries that intervene in other parts of the world in the name of either development or humanitarianism. So we looked at securitization, state violence and criminality, projects to uplift victims for the sake of capitalist development or to save them from the ravages of armed conflict and mass displacement. But then we got a fourth one because we realized the power of media in producing the common sense that supports these kinds of interventions and makes us see the world as we do. So we looked at the role that journalism and the gatekeeping that goes on in journalism and media play in relation to these kinds of apparatuses and forms of power and governance. And it's sort of, GBVAW works kind of differently in each of these 4 circuits, or as it's attached to these 4 circuits. And that helped us kind of figure out all the forms of cunning that exist and the ways it works. And they weren't, but we had quite a lot to work with. Amazing, amazing contributions. But our struggle as the editors was to figure out, okay, what does this all mean? What did we discover by bringing these case studies together? And we think it's helpful as a kind of heuristic to kind of disentangle these circuits of power to which GBVAW got attached.
Yeah,
I'll stop there.
Yeah. Well, I think that then sort of throws open a whole other area that I'd like to get into in a moment, which is that of feminism and what kind of feminism are we left with. But I just wanted to mention to the audience, we will have time for Q&A. I think I will open it up after this next question. So if you have any comments or questions, please put them in the Q&A function. I see we already have one question. I mean, I understand when you're talking about gender violence that it's, Rema, you were talking about it, that it's important to hold on to it as a political category, that, while it doesn't have like a very specific meaning attached to it, we need it politically. So now I'm curious about feminism. So the book addresses questions about feminist choices in relation to the so-called success story of GBVAW. Now, given the very problematic outcome of integrating feminist concerns into major institutions and circuits of global governance, what should feminists do? And what are the alternatives? What feminist strategies in relation to gender violence are you suggesting? So I think I would really like to hear from all of you. We start with Lila again.
Yeah, and then I can give the others the last word since they have so much more to say about this. But I think actually each of us and all the people who contributed to this project have different ideas about strategies and what would be the alternatives. And as you said, we talk about when we say that the reasons for the success of this, they're actually complicated. And what we want to acknowledge is that there's been plenty of criticism from within, and we're talking, really as internal criticism to feminism. As are you okay with me? It says my internet is unstable. Everything's okay?
Fine. We can hear you. Everything's fine.
There's plenty of criticism from within about the agenda's failure to deliver an end to gender violence. No question that so many feminists have worked really hard for decades and in good faith for the goals of addressing and condemning gender violence with a small g, and that's the way we think about it, the real problem. And the agenda has been disappointing to many because certain ideals got watered down, compromises had to be made in order to do this work. And, I really, I love Janet Halley's argument that, as internal critic to governance feminism, she says there are the 5 C's that alignments with power, risk, or entail: collaboration, compromise, collusion, complicity, and co-optation. We actually don't push that way, but what we end with is, a lot of the way this is framed is that, should you continue to engage with these institutions and the GBVAW agenda or not? And they're often presented as a feminist Hobson's choice. That was not a term I knew about, but being included in the systems to be able to have some chance of having issues of gender violence attended to, or gender at all, as Rema pointed out, or women, or on the other hand, exclusion from them and an inability to affect policies. And one of the most thoughtful legal scholars that I've run across through this work and through Nadera and others, Fionnuala Ní Iolaine, who said of the Security Council and counterterrorism, which is the part I was working on, she says, quote, "To remain outside is to forfeit the possibility of exercising any influence on the decisions and actions that affect the lives of millions of women and girls across the globe living through situations of extremity and violence. And she's a rapporteur around counterterrorism. But for us, this is kind of a false choice. And to me, it looks a little more like a Faustian bargain. And we have to think about what it means to be political. What does it mean to be feminist? The question that you just raised. What is feminism? What are feminisms? And what we say in the book is that missing from these calculations about whether we should engage or versus forfeiting the possibility of influence is a reading of the nature of power in the rationales wielded by these hegemonic institutions, these circuits of power that we talk about. So what does inclusion mean? And I'm going to let Nadera and Rema, I think, say more about this, but I just want to take this chance maybe to talk about what I came up with in my own chapter, which was about feminist engagements with countering violent extremism, the sort of soft branch of counterterrorism. And I called those who engaged with it securo-feminists. And I said, the problem is by embracing the term violent extremism, they're already trapped. And, I started questioning, like, what is violent? What is extremist? What is violence? Is only that violence carried out in the name of a particular religious ideology or a group? Extremists, pacifists, feminist critics of war. These are old traditions in feminism, those working against the patriarchal norms of masculinity, male dominance, and politics. They've long organized against various forms of violence in home, the prison, international sphere. And, those of us who went through I didn't go through the Iraq War, but who lived, I'm teaching, so some of my students really haven't lived the things that we have lived, but, shock and awe carried out by powerful armies, bombers, drones, proxy, militias. Aren't these violent extremism? Their effects on people are, catastrophic. So the point that I make in my chapter is that violent extremism is as much of an empty signifier as its partner term, radicalization, which people like Nadia Fadel and her colleagues have argued, looking at these policies in Europe, preventing violent extremism. And the deployment reduces these very complicated political and historical dynamics to simple problems with pat solutions. And they sort of, as Nadera said earlier, they depoliticize, they could decontextualize violence at the same time that they're dehumanizing certain groups, certain communities, and not others. And so, I looked at this literature on CVE and, involvement in, defending feminists' involvement in it. Where's the reflexive analysis of US European policies towards parts of the world where violent extremists are said to breed, and that's the kind of language that's used, or metastasize, other kind of pathological metaphors that are used to talk about them. What about security states changing course? What about pursuing political rather than military solutions? What about banning global arms production and sales? What about stopping support for violent allies or proxies? There are ways that we could work to limit massive destruction, injury, deprivation, death, capitalism, all of this. And I think the Costs of War project at Brown, at the Watson Institute, where you are, Nadia, is one of the most important kind of resources that's been developed that asks that question, calculating the costs of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, but not just in weapons and death tolls, but alternative ways that this kind of funding could have been used on education, health, welfare. All of those are feminist issues.
Yes.
So they're core feminist issues. And I think you've talked about that for Iraq with your colleagues. So why the gruesome sensationalism about sexual slavery under ISIS, yes, that's bad. But also there's all kinds of other things that have happened in Iraq and was produced out of it. So all of that, I sort of end by saying, the gendered lens of feminism is crucial. I don't want to let go of that. But, can it be more wide angled? Can it be trained not just on subjects predefined by others and rife with these kind of obfuscating terms? So it's sort of about how we are going to define what feminist politics should work for or work against. And that was sort of my take on all of this, my, what strategy? Let's, we're bigger than that. We can take on the whole problem. But I think Nadera and Rema have, coming from different places, working on different things, also have brought up really important ways that we think differently. And some of it sort of mentioned, but I'd like to have them do that.
Sure. Can I just mention we have now quite a number of audience questions. So could I ask you, Nadera and Rema, to try to keep it short? So Nadera, why don't you go next?
I will just continue Lila's line. I think that I totally agree with what Lila is saying, and everything that is being done is done really, as Walid Daqqa said, without noise. So the violence, the gender violence, asking us to participate in 1325 because they want to train women to be part of the negotiating table when there is no table to negotiate on, so imposing women's agenda or issues that are related, for example, to secret information that is used by security state and that is so gendered, or the issue that I raise in my chapter on the fact that walk to school for schoolgirls from 7 to 8, and the fact that there are guns there, and those guns are part of the penetratability of the power of the occupiers. So what is there for us as feminists is to remember that gender violence is central to state making, and it sustains state power, as Kamala Viswarson and others, Interpol in her piece, and that state violence can even work through humanitarian registers of concerns that Rema have taught us, whether saving or sympathy, but it's there, yeah? And when dealing with states from the global south, we really must remember that the global south should not always be staged as a site of mere application of theory and policy, when those walking the halls of power are theorizing, and then the applicability is on against marginalized, otherized, colonized, racialized individuals and communities. So and the book also stresses the fact that gender violence extends to men and boys of minoritized group, as well as sexual minorities, and addressing the apparatus of GBVAW from a state crime perspective, as my contribution allows us to really detect the way state violence works through gender, and allows feminists to engage with the violence of the state institution, to examine the law and see how it's done. It's all done, dispossession and violence is done legally, and draw from indigenous conceptualization of justice or denial of justice, and looking at, for example, the everydayness, because it's so important, looking at life, looking at politics, and remembering that the cunning of gender violence is really integral to the workings of the state and state power, biopolitically, necropolitically. So instead of reductive, one size fits all, feminists really need to understand the complexity, the historicity, the politics, the importance of context-specific analysis and solution. And we really need to carefully listen to women, survivors, and those that are defying violence in the context. So if you go back to my example that I gave, one should always be hyper aware of where one is standing. So the funders did not speak the language. So how can you represent feminism if you don't understand, you don't comprehend, you're not using, you're not able to relate, to engage to the context, and not assume that our frames and our discourses aren't bearers of power and erasure. So really, GBVAW is a capital in the hands of those empowered, and therefore the importance to understand it more sensitively and looking at it. And it is important, but really looking at those areas that are not making noise, the walk to school, education, the secrecy, and the way it penetrates gender and so on.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the feminists in Iraq, and I mean, clearly Palestine, or in Turkey and Kurdish in Egypt, I mean, I feel that, of course, I mean, there are all kinds of feminists, but, especially I feel the young generation has precisely those kind of, is employing many of those strategies that Lila, you and also Nadera are talking about. I mean, I think that it's, Iraqi young feminists who are at the forefront of challenging authoritarianism and sectarianism, while also, advocating or, campaigning around gender violence. And I mean, I personally think that there is quite a bit of that happening in the Middle East, which is, very hopeful. And I think also more globally. Rema, what is your take on this set of questions?
Yeah, no, on the solutions,
Yeah.
No, it's like when people say, what's the solution for Palestine? Well, kind of no, but it's just not so easy to get there. I mean, what I keep finding all along the way, I found so ironic when sort of looking at GBVAW and what it does, is that it's sort of precursor, which was the Euro-American battered women's movement over the 1970s, centrally put this feminist ethical protocol around how you deal with victims of gender violence, which was that you should use a victim-centered approach, right? I mean, this is really sort of a huge, huge concept. And, which is recognizing the importance of respecting the agency of victims of gender violence, to be in charge of their experience, both in terms of how it should be read and understood, how it should be treated, what interventions they see preferable. So there's this huge thing, around the agency of understanding the experience and going forward should be with the victim, they use the language survivor. When it comes to GBVAW, right, all of this agency to decide is taken completely out of the hands of local activists and away from, victims. The naming of the causes, the treatments, everything else is predetermined by, these global norms and packages and techniques. The only agent in all of this are the international agencies and their bureaucrats themselves. And it's really rather stunning. I mean, I really find it so stunning that, calling on some kind of feminist anti-violence legacy that was all around, the agency of victims, and then you're doing what that older literature would call, re-victimization, basically, in terms of sort of the power relations. Anyway, so simply put, what's fundamentally needed is a shift outward and downward to what we in the book sort of called the marginalized center of GBVAW, the context of its actual operations and where its effects are felt. The Palestinians, the DRCs, the Bangladeshis. Let local activists, frontline workers, and gender violence victims decide what the problem is, the language to be used for it is, as well as the necessary solutions. And this also means dealing with the whole issue of the politics of care that we talked about last week, both in terms of making care for victims of gender violence actually responsive to their needs, rather than these pre-packaged global best practice modalities that are really, as we see over and over again in the book, just very, very disconnected from what people really need. As well as deciding, this is, I think, is central, to let them also decide whether addressing gender violence is the priority form of care needed at all. You know, I mean, as my talk last week on Gaza suggested, for most women in Gaza, you ask them what their priority of care is end Israeli violence and the siege, right? Or if you can't do that, at least, you know, address the material effects of all of that Israeli violence on my family's well-being and livelihood, right? I mean, GBV is not really the main priority for, you know, especially in terms of how it's framed by GBVAW. And relatively, I think is the need to start calling out sort of the claims to representation in the political sense that enables GBVAW to keep going forward. I mean, Lila already sort of raised this, you know, the whole thing about inclusion or not inclusion. This whole army of UN GBVAW experts and allied feminist think tanks, credentialized NGOs, and academics involved in the production and circulation of GBVAW do not represent anyone in any democratic sense at all, right? Their claim to representation is increasingly based solely on notions of feminist expertise, right? Who elected them to decide what women out there in the world suffer from and need? You know, I mean, this is sort of what Wendy Brown calls, you know, where's the demos? Where are the people in terms of, you know, this claim to representation? So I think the issue of feminist popular sovereignty is at the heart of what needs to change, right? Here, what we have are feminist sovereigns. We don't have feminist sovereignty, you know, popular sovereignty at all.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you, all three of you. We have quite a number of questions, so I'd like to give as many people an answer for me to read out their questions. I'll read out maybe 2 or 3, and then you can choose to answer one. You don't have to answer all of them, and maybe you can try to keep it quick. So first, a comment by Sarah Ababne. Talat in Palestine are a great example of a group which refuses this depoliticization of the hegemonic GBVAW discourse. She loves this conceptualization of the GBVAW discourse of violence and would love her students to read the book or at least watch this. So I can say that the recording will be made available later on, so you can share it with the students. And I understand that the book will come out by 2023. Am I right? That's so, yeah. So you'll find it then in the future. It's in the making, but you can definitely get the recording of the talk. So a question by Aduna Milhem. Manal Hassan has written an article about family honor and how it is seen by Palestinian society inside Israel. In your perspective, is the problem how we as Palestinians see honor in culture or our acts toward it? Is it something that we can change or that can be changed by time? And then I will take another question by Emma de Jong. How involved are the individual voices of Muslim women used in framing your condemnation of gender violence? Although it seems the overarching political institutions are in control and have the loudest voice, but how can the perspective of the women on the front lines of these various forms of violence be emphasized? Okay. So who would like to say something about the first question?
I think Nadera is an obvious, because she's written about this.
I can say about, I can really stress what Sarah Ababni said regarding Talat, and I think Talat was really very clear in situating themselves politically and contextually, and it was really it really looked at and at least situated the Palestinian feminism in a very historicized and politicized and of course gendered manner. As to Manar Hassan have written about it. Yes, it's in, I think that article in 89 or 91, that where she really exposed the political work of the crime of honor in femicide, as I call it in my work, in Palestine. And I think what she have done is just to show how, although she did not call it the state at that time, but Manar really did a great job, and it was the first article in looking at Palestinian violence against Palestinian women by Palestinian men inside the state of Israel, and showing how the state was playing with that violence. And by doing this, it furthered it, it empowered men in one side, it emasculated them from the other side. So I guess that what happened inside Israel, if you see the amount of violence today, the fact that the state is really playing so well in divide and rule, in silencing dissent, in allowing some to speak, in the issue of, for example, not being able to call for help, because if the only space to call for help is the police, and Palestinians do not trust the Israeli police, and the Israeli police will use that call for help in order to play with it and in order to dominate and control and expose a society. So there is this violence of the reaction and violence of exposure. So the politics of exposure is an issue that was raised by feminist work in Palestine. But the way the state is governing and playing, visibilizing some, all you hear is violence against women. And we have major issue of violence today, because at one point we were not allowed to use guns. Today, they are allowing guns. So those guns are being used against women and against community members. It's a complicated issue. And what I would say is that this, the play of the state, the fact that the police is not an answer, the prosecutors are not an answer, the law is not our law, the courts are really very, very, very problematic, because we're still using the different sets of laws. It complicates the situation, and it takes us back to the fact that normative tools do not work if we come back to our argument in the book, and the codification of the different protocols to come and implement it in against Palestinian women fails to expose the assemblages and the different apparatuses that are at play.
Thank you. Okay, would anyone like to answer Emma De Young's question? How involved are the individual voices of Muslim women used in framing your condemnation of gender violence? Anyone would like to get in there?
Well, I could say that whether, if you look at the case of in our book, at least the article by the chapter by Inderpal Grewal, or where she talks about the violence of the state, India against the Kashmiris, or in my case here, I think that women are deeply involved. If that is the question, is whether they are seen, acknowledged, heard, taken into consideration, counted, because usually the question is what kind of acts you count, what kinds of acts you don't count, but they are quite visible to me, to us.
Right. Okay, I'll move to the next question.
If I could just add, because sorry, I was trying to understand the question. There are many voices of women who happen to be Muslim, right, in the study. Sort of, so there are women in Gaza. There are also women from Hamas in Gaza. In the case of Bangladesh, most of the researchers happened to be either Muslim or people who work on Islam. But I think that's a sort of happen to be, as opposed to it being specifically a Muslim voice, if that helps.
Thank you. Okay, I'll go to the next question, a couple of questions, one by Hanan Dahour. Thank you so much for the interesting webinar. Violence exerted on women at an individual basis are the easiest to solve. How about gender-based violence that is institutional? What could be the solution, bearing in mind the complexity of scales or the circuits of power you describe? And then there's a question by Nasira Gwenev. Thank you for such deeply awakening thoughts you all offered. I listened to your talk as I walked back from the Russian embassy in Paris under heavy protection. How do the contributions in your important edited book address the connections, continuities, and also discontinuities between the framing, racialization, and criminalization of Muslim women in Western Europe and in countries that some of the pieces you mentioned study, notably through the media and the state policies of Western countries? Okay, so who'd like to have a go about gender-based violence that is institutional?
I mean, I think, can I just say something? I mean, I think Nadera just answered that question, talking about the institutionalization. And Nasira, it's wonderful to see that you're here because you were part of one of our events in this whole series. And I think they're answering their own questions by bringing up these connections. We didn't actually, but for Nasira's question, we didn't actually have anyone who worked on Europe, right? We have Americanists who worked on America, and we have all the rest of us who worked on, and I guess I'm an American working on America with the secure feminism, but people who come from and work in communities in these various places. And I think I think Rema is sort of saying that, these are the voices, this is what we're trying to get at, is these alternatives. Maybe I forgot the question, but I just think we should say thank you for these contributions, because they're not really questions, but they're the issues that we all are already thinking about. And hopefully you will all help us think about them. I think there's so many people out there who were part of this project and were not part of this project. And nice to see Sarah Ababna too, who is very much part of this project, who are all thinking along these lines. And the more we can do this kind of critique and think about where to put our emphasis, I think the better.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Lila. So just maybe a couple last questions. One by Saleh Al-Wazza, who's speaking from the Lebanese context. She's interested to know how your work addresses the NGOization of women's movements and how NGOs themselves, supposedly civil actors working for women's rights and protections, become concerned with donors and funders' goals, often at the expense of alternative solutions to gender violence. Ali Yildirim is asking, so first of all, thanking you for this seminar. I'd be happy if the speakers can share more about how religion in its most institutionalized, politicized, and/or everyday form, and by extension, secularization discussions are situated in connection to the conceptualization of the cunning of gender violence. Looking forward to reading the book.
Yes.
I'm happy to take on the NGO question. So a couple of chapters, mine in relation to Gaza, Dina Siddiqui's in relation to Bangladesh, and Zima Shafsari's in relation to LGBT claims in the refugee asylum regime. Each one of them in different ways deals with the whole issue of NGOs. And I think what you see in, especially the Gaza case, is a situation in which NGOs are highly precaritized and they have no choice. There's nothing else out there that's going to give them resources to work on women's issues anymore. So they work within these, but they're really critical and they're constantly subverting them and finding ways around them, etc. And then in the case of Bangladesh, you know, you've got something, I think, similar but not so hard, in which there is some kind of buy-in from some you know, women NGOs, women in NGO forms and things like this to parts of the agenda. At the same time, there's also a lot of criticism, but it's, you know, as I was trying to sort of say earlier at the outset, the Palestine case shows you how incredibly powerful this apparatus is. And it also works a lot through sort of economic vulnerability and precarity, which NGOs increasingly, at least third world NGOs, increasingly suffer from. And so sort of there's a kind of power of coercion here, rather than a subjectification and a total belief in the ideology and in the whole package. But I think, you know, one needs to read it. Again, we're always saying context. You have to read it from context to context.
Yeah,
that would be my answer.
yeah, thank you. Anyone would like to ask about the institutionalized, politicized, and everyday forms of religion, and also secularization discussions, and how are they connected to the cunning of gender violence, if at all? Would anyone like to speak to this?
Let me just continue a little bit on the NGOization and remind us all that, you know, the NGOization from one side and the funding politics, which is, as I have said in my own work previously, it's funding pain. Only if you show your pain and your agony and your wounding and your victimization and so on, you'll be funded. This is one thing. Another thing, especially here in our context, is that the fact that even if you get the funding, you need to sign that you are against terrorism when the terrorism against you is all we see. So that also kind of traps all the work of NGOs, but at the same time, it also muffles their ability to come up with different modes of dealing with the violences, and especially the foundational violence here in our context. As to the issue of religion and the cunning, I guess that if you look at the entire book, and if you look at what goes on, if you just take India, for example, and you see how the sacralization of politics, as I say in my latest edited book with Nadim Rahana, the fact that politics became so sacred that, you know, Modi is claiming clearly that India is for the Hindus and Kashmiris should go away. If you look at Myanmar and you look at violence there, even by somebody, you know, San Suu Kyi was a Nobel Prize laureate, yeah, and she ended up abusing and causing so much harm to Myanmars that are Muslims. In our case, in Palestine, the sacralization of politics is hard at work. You know, just look at the religion and the way religion is there to give the the Jewish men and women the right to be here, and it's all in the name of the, you know, the biblical claims, the chosen people and the promised land, while otherizing, marginalizing, and staging Palestinians as totally out. So I guess in different ways, you know, or look at the staging religion in Letty Volp's article, when she looks at the invocation of religion in different ways in order to evict women, or in order to, when she, in one of her articles, when talking about Germany and looking at immigrants or refugees, and showing how they're called refugees, like that, the moment they are the Muslim others, so they're framing the mode of looking at them is framed as, they're codified differently, and they're also to control. So the element of the game here, the cunning here, is so clear.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'm really sorry, but we've actually run out of time. My apologies to all those of you who asked questions and we were not able to address them. But thanks so much. Thank you, Nadera, Rema, and Lila. This was very interesting, super fascinating and evocative discussion. And yeah, I'm looking forward to reading the book. As I said, the event will be available, the recording will be available in a few days' time, so you can either rewatch it or share it with your friends, colleagues, and students. And yeah, just a big thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Nadia, for inviting us and
Of course.
really engaging us in such a good way. I mean, we didn't get to everything, but
no, that's never possible.
You really
yes,
found a way to capture the
yes.
essence of what we're trying to do here, and hopefully people will read the book someday.
Yes, yes.
And we'll finish the book someday. But thank you, Nadia.
Okay, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Bye. Thank you so much.